حتى يقولا إنما نحن فتنة فلا تكفر فيتعلمون منهما ما يفرقون به بين المرء وزوجه وما هم بضار.
Good afternoon, everybody here at St Mungo Museum and everybody joining us from... That's the feedback. Good afternoon, those of us who are joining from the Broadcasting Scotland channel, and of course to those of you here at the St Mungo Museum. I know quite a few of you in this room. My name is Julie Adair and I'm the chair of Remembering Srebrenica Scotland. Our aim, as many of you know, is to carry on telling the stories from Srebrenica and many other places in Bosnia from the war in the 90s, from Prijedor, from Visegrad, from Mostar, from Sarajevo, so that the lessons from that time will be shared among Scotland, among the people of Scotland, critically our schools, so that we never forget what happened in the 90s and what happened particularly in Srebrenica. You know why you're here today. We've got two very good speakers for you today. We have Robert, who, as you know, was a forensic scientist during the war, just after the war. He has recently published, in fact this is the Scottish launch event of his book Grave Faces, which you can see over there, and he spent several years as a forensic technician in Bosnia, tasked with providing physical and scientific evidence against the crimes against humanity which were committed in the Balkans from 1992 onwards. Along with that time, and for those of you who know this museum, you'll know that here he has also displayed a number of the paintings which he created after the war. And for those of you who haven't yet seen them, I would thoroughly recommend a little visit upstairs later on to see some of his work. Interviewing him today is one of the charity's trustees, Marcely Fraser. Marcely worked in Bosnia after the war with the Office of the High Representative, who at that time was Paddy Ashdown, and she stayed working in Bosnia, both in Sarajevo and in Mostar between 2013 and 2016. So these are both people who have real lived experience of what happened in Bosnia during and after the war, and this is going to be a fascinating 40 to 50 minutes, I think, of hearing about Robert's experiences and a little bit about what's been happening since then. I'll hand over to you and I'll hand you my back.
Thank you, Julie. I hope you can all hear me, and please shout if you can't. I'm really delighted to be here today talking to Robert about his new book, Grave Faces. As Julie mentioned, Robert had a long career as a forensic technician here in Glasgow, and between 1996 and 2002 was part of several international forensic teams that were sent to the former Yugoslavia to investigate war crimes. Robert was, I don't know if Julie mentioned this, awarded an MBE in '99 for his work. He's also an old friend of Remembering Srebrenica in Scotland. Robert, you were the charity's first vice chair, and I think you continue to be one of the most tireless ambassadors on behalf of Remembering Srebrenica UK. And what's very special about what you do is that you bring your direct experience of investigating the genocide in Bosnia to a huge number of audiences and organisations, both in this country and abroad. And we're really grateful to you for that, and I'm also delighted to call you a friend. I think when we first met a few years ago, you told me that in the space of about a week, you had given talks about your work in Bosnia to secondary school pupils in Glasgow, members of the Scottish Parliament, and inmates at Barlinnie Prison. I'm not going to ask you to tell us which of those audiences were best behaved, but I think it's an indication of just how much you do personally to make sure that the Bosnian conflict and the genocide at Srebrenica is not forgotten. So we're going to talk about Robert's new book. We're going to hear Robert reading some extracts from the book, and then I hope we'll have some time for questions from the audience before we wrap up. And of course, we hope that you will buy a copy of the book afterwards, and Robert is donating his proceeds from book sales to an organisation in Bosnia that supports survivors of the war. So, Robert, the book really brings to life the really important work you did as a forensic technician in Bosnia and later in Kosovo. I certainly found it a really powerful and very personal account of what those first deployments were like. You were, of course, gathering evidence to support war crimes prosecutions in the new International Criminal Tribunal that had been set up in The Hague to investigate war crimes across the former Yugoslavia. And just to remind the audience, the Bosnian War was a really brutal war at the heart of Europe. It led to the deaths of 100,000 people, and many of them civilians. And of course, it devastated the lives of countless others. So your task was to help set up a forensic operation that would establish how thousands of people buried in mass graves died. And we now know that many of the remains that your team examined were some of the 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys who were systematically executed by Bosnian Serb forces over a few really dreadful days in July 1995 in and around Srebrenica. And of course, we now know that the evidence that you and your colleagues collected contributed to the prosecution of several Bosnian Serb military, security and political figures. And of course, the most prominent of them would be Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. And their crimes against the Bosnian Muslim population of Srebrenica were ruled by two different international courts as genocide. But I'd like to take you back to that first mission in 1996 and your first deployment with Physicians for Human Rights. At the time, you were working in Glasgow in a busy teaching hospital. And you're very honest in the book, and you say that you didn't actually know that much about the war in Bosnia at the time. In fact, I think you were originally supposed to be going to Rwanda. Yeah. So can you tell us what motivated you to go on that first mission, and I guess what were your expectations?
Thanks, Marcely. Well, in 1995, the charity Physicians for Human Rights asked forensic medicine departments throughout the world if they could provide personnel to travel to Rwanda following the genocide there. And I was packed and ready to go there when I received a call in early 1996 to go instead to Bosnia because aerial photography had discovered that there was disturbed earth around the Srebrenica area that they believed may contain the bodies of thousands of Bosnian Muslims who simply disappeared on July the 11th, 1995. And so, as Marcely said, I didn't really know very much about the war in Bosnia. It just seemed so confused and complicated. However, I learned very quickly when I went out there and joined the first team of international specialists, forensic pathologists, forensic anthropologists, radiographers, and police officers, and we were taken to the town of Tuzla, which was one of the other so-called safe areas in Bosnia, Srebrenica being another. And there were 6 so-called safe areas in Bosnia where the UN, in an attempt to try and help, I suppose, designated areas where Muslims, refugees could go to because they were virtually trapped in the country because they were surrounded by the Croatians and the Serbians, both of whom were fighting or attacking the Bosniaks. And so I was taken to a temporary mortuary in Tuzla. Well, not in Tuzla, it was outside Tuzla, near the first of the mass graves, a grave called Serska, where many of the victims from Srebrenica were being exhumed. Enough for that?
Yeah, and I mean, when you arrived, the war had really been over for a matter of months.
Yeah.
There was a peace agreement signed in late 1995, and that basically divided the country into 2 highly autonomous regions. One was predominantly Bosnian Muslim and Croat, and the other an entity called Republika Srpska, or the Serb Republic. And the peace deal was controversial, to say the least. Of course, it had the great achievement of stopping the fighting, but many believed it had actually legitimised the ethnic cleansing campaign that the Bosnian Serb military and political leadership had conducted, which really aimed to create ethnically homogenous territory across vast swathes of Bosnia. So much of that territory that was gained during the war then became part of the new sort of state within a state after the war. And many of the same people who'd been in power during the war continued to be in power afterwards. And I just wonder what it was like to be deployed into that situation as part of an investigation into war crimes, which was obviously a really charged issue. There were NATO troops there overseeing the peace agreement, but the situation was still incredibly tense. Yep. Although the International Criminal Tribunal had issued indictments, at that point there had been no arrests in 1996, and in fact war criminals were being aided and sheltered by those in power. And even the NATO troops were under sort of instruction not to arrest war crime suspects unless they sort of literally fell over them. Thankfully, that position changed later on. But can you tell us a bit about the work? Obviously, the Criminal Tribunal was a new and very pioneering institution. It was the first international war crimes tribunal since Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials after the Second World War. But it's probably fair to say at the beginning that it was a fairly under-resourced institution, and it would be interesting to hear what the conditions were like on that first mission, what it was like in that first temporary mortuary you worked in, and some of the...
We're only going to be questioned. They would be safe. They just answer a few questions and they would join the women who were expelled from Srebrenica to Tuzla. And so the women are arriving in Tuzla, and that was an arduous journey for them. We're expecting their men to arrive at any time, and one or two stragglers started arriving there, and the women went to them asking where their loved one were, and they were told that everyone is dead. And so our job was to try and establish, as I say, how those people had died. It's important to note that when forensic people do their job, they do it in that way, in a forensic way. And sometimes it can take quite a long time for a pathologist and an anthropologist to establish exactly why someone had died. However, there was so much pressure on the team to get through the work because the bodies were coming. Pressure on the team to get through the work because the bodies were coming to us in containers of up to 200 at a time, and we were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of bodies. And the ICTY too were keen to get as much evidence as quickly as possible. But I have to say, and I'm glad that it went this way, that the forensic specialist would not be pushed into trying to take shortcuts, because were they to do so, they would know that these cases would come to court, and the defenders or those accused had some of the finest legal teams in the world, especially those at the top, and it wouldn't take much for them to challenge any evidence and for cases to collapse. And so that meant that for that first trip in 1996, we didn't really get through very much, and at one point we had to abandon the mortuary for a couple of days because fighting had broken out in the village nearby. And for our safety we had to close down. Plus it was a major international news story at the time, and so media people were constantly trying to get a story from us, and that interrupted work as well. So and the conditions were terrible, as Marcely pointed out. There was, for everyone in Bosnia,
Serb forces would inflict on them. This obviously followed successive international failures to broker peace agreements during the war, and you do reflect on some of these failures in the book. And in one section you mention the ambivalence you felt actually wearing the UN uniform in those early days in Bosnia, and some of the negative reactions that sort of provoked in some of the Bosnian people you met. On the other hand, you were part of a more positive chapter in international engagement. You were part of a pioneering and highly qualified international team that had some really remarkable figures in it, yourself included. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about some of the people you worked with. I thought it was fascinating that you mentioned that many of the forensic anthropologists were in fact from South American countries, and they'd had experience of exhuming the remains of people who'd disappeared, i.e. been exterminated by various South American military regimes. And it would be really interesting if you could also mention a little bit about Bill Haglund and some of the remarkable lengths he went to in his work in Bosnia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, as you rightly say, Marcely, anthropology, forensic anthropology in the UK was actually not heard of before, or very little folk had heard about it. Each university had an archaeology or anthropology department, maybe with one professor. In America, in particular in South America, anthropologists, particularly forensic anthropologists, were absolute experts because they had worked throughout the 70s and 80s dealing with the bones from victims of the juntas in the various South American countries, Guatemala, Peru, Argentina, etc. And I was told by one pathologist, an American pathologist who his wife actually studied anthropology, and they would go out to the deserts of Arizona and pick up the bones of murdered victims. It was quite common to get rid of dead bodies that way, and she became his assistant and became an anthropologist. But you mentioned Bill Haglund, and he is really quite a famous character in the forensic world. He started off doing exactly the same job that I did, but in Seattle, and he worked in a mortuary there where it was quite quiet, and so he decided to spend a lot of his time studying bones, and gradually became the most famous anthropologist in the world. He attended many mass deaths in America. There's one you may not have heard of, I hadn't at the time, called the Green River murders, where dozens of people were murdered. And he came there with, I realised that it became sort of normal for anthropologists to look a bit like Indiana Jones. They all wear soft hats and leather jackets and so on. Bill was quite an elderly man, but he was also a bit of a poet. And when I first met him, we got to chat because we had a common background. He was quite famous though for his poor driving, and in one of the chapters in the book I talk about when we had to evacuate the mortuary. One of the tunnels that we'd gone through had been mined, and they decided to take us over in their 4x4 over the top of this tunnel, and that was pretty hairy. So, but Bill, he wrote a book called The Graves, and it was more about the anthropological work that was done out in the mass graves there. He was very attached, it sounds bizarre, but he became very protective to the bodies in the graves, and he actually lived by the gravesite because he didn't trust the military to protect the graves properly. And so you can imagine when Bill came to visit us in Tuzla, because of the fact that there was little running water, etc., we realised that not only we smelled badly, but Bill smelled a hell of a lot worse than we did.
Robert, I'm going to ask you to read an extract from the book just now, if you don't mind. Okay. It describes the first visit you made to a mass grave site near the village of Tserska.
Yeah, okay. I'll just put a wee bit of context in that, I mentioned that we had to abandon the mortuary. It closed down for 2 days, and the chief pathologist wanted to go out and speak to Bill Haglund at the gravesite, and he asked if I'd accompany him on that journey, and I was quite keen to see the my first mass grave, and so I'll try and read this. Okay. The area beyond the periphery of the grave was surrounded by about a dozen armed American I-4 troops facing outward with their backs to the grave. As we drove forward, I could smell it before seeing it. I climbed out of the vehicle and walked over to the edge of the grave. I gasped and swallowed hard, taking in the attack on my visual and olfactory senses. It took me a few seconds to grasp what lay before me. At first I thought I was just looking at a huge mud-filled hole in the ground, interspersed with small bundles of filthy, discoloured and torn rags. The horror gradually became clearer as my eyes slowly adjusted to it. Jesus Christ, I said to myself, I'm looking into the bowels of hell. There were 5 anthropologists, 3 women and 2 men wearing PHR, that's Physicians for Human Rights, t-shirts, paper face masks and blue Tyvek paper suits. Each one was working in silence in a recently partially exposed body, carefully separating the decomposing flesh of each of the contorted and commingled bodies from the mud, using what looked like garden trowels. One man had a spade, but the time for shovelling had passed. Another using a flat paintbrush to gently expose the contours of a face. The bodies once exposed were very fragile and too easily damaged, and so great care had to be taken when handling them. The victims had to be treated carefully from now onwards, not only out of respect for them and their families, but because their bodies and the crime scenes around them would provide important evidence for the prosecution of their killers. I tried to imagine those days last June, just around a year ago, where the men and boys were blindfolded, had their hands tied behind their backs, and were pushed onto buses and trucks and taken to the killing fields to be executed. Then their killers dumped the dying and dead victims into this and many other pits. I wondered what on earth went through the minds of the victims as they stumbled towards the increasing sound of the gunfire ahead of them. Were they pleading for their lives with anyone willing to listen, praying to their God, calling out for their mothers or wives, or were they walking silently in the knowledge that their fate was sealed? I wondered too about the killers who over 3 or 4 hot sunny days killed 8,000 plus men and boys. I wish they could be brought here now to look again at the result of their crimes. So many unanswered questions flooded my mind. In the grave, 2 anthropologists gently rolled a body recently freed from the hellish mud into a once white body bag destined for the mortuary. The way they handled the body reminded me of how carefully nurses would turn a sick patient in their hospital bed to prevent pressure sores. I confirmed in my mind that I would try to ensure that at all times everyone would treat the victims with the dignity they deserved. I struggled to grasp a sense of what the growing number of families who were beginning to accept that their husbands, sons, brothers and grandfathers were dead might be going through now, not knowing if their father or their sons were among this grim pile of humanity, grief and horror. But also I wondered what the parents or children of the killers would feel were they to see this carnage carried out so systematically and with such cruelty by their husbands, sons or fathers. It was impossible to count or even estimate the number of bodies in this grave. Signs of many other victims were poking out of the walls of the grave. A hand here, a foot there, a hunched spine and scapula commingled together with other bones and body parts. In one corner, a head with a wide open jaw was visible between the legs of another victim, looking like an impossibly grotesque smiling contortionist. Discoloured mud-caked clothing was strewn around between the bodies. Dozens of small triangular red flags on sticks had been stuck into the ground by the exhumation team, each one denoting an individual. It would be easy to count them, to get an idea of the number showing, but they couldn't yet tell how many others had been lying underneath the indicators. The only sound on this beautiful sunny day was the hum from the engine of a yellow backhoe excavating digger, scraping the surface of yet another new grave. The driver was manipulating the bucket of the backhoe so carefully that it reminded me of a surgeon performing a delicate operation with his scalpel as he scratched away the top surface of the grey earth so as not to touch the bodies below.
Whew. Thanks, Robert. That really paints such a vivid picture of such a distressing scene that I'm sure most of us can't even imagine. And I want to return to some of those thoughts you had about both the victims and the perpetrators that were running through your head, and I'm sure still do, as you looked at that dreadful scene. I was also really struck by the way you described the delicate way the bodies were being exhumed, and also your determination to ensure that some kind of dignity for the deceased was respected in your work. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that process that you went through to literally piece back together the bodies and establish the cause of death. One of the really grim facts, of many grim facts about what you found, was that many of the bodies that had been exhumed were in fact buried in secondary graves, and even some in tertiary graves. And I wondered if you could tell us why that was done and what impact it had on your really incredibly difficult forensic work.
Yes. Well, I returned to Bosnia in the following year in 1997, and there were rumours then that the primary graves had been re-entered over the winter time when the team had stopped working, and that those bodies, or they were discovering graves that were empty. There was no the odd sign that there was some people there, but the bodies had disappeared. And it wasn't until 1998, the following year, that we were told finally that secondary graves were being discovered. And what had happened was that the Serbs entering the primary graves, removing the bodies, then using mechanical diggers, tore them apart, desecrated the bodies, and then reburied them in secondary graves. And the point of that, I guess, was to try and obfuscate their crimes. They buried the bodies or the body parts in secondary graves, sometimes way in further into Republika Srpska, in places where they thought that they would never be found. And if they were to be found, they would never be able to be put together again. And this news to the families of the missing, you can imagine, was devastating. This was now 3 years on from when we first learned of the executions. And instead of us dealing with the 8,000 plus victims' bodies, we were now faced with over 17,000 body parts that had to be put together again. But by this time, DNA was well established, DNA matching. But for the team, it became a huge task to put the bodies together again. This is where I'd like to pay tribute to the forensic anthropologists who managed to do that, because of the 8,500 victims from Srebrenica. It took 20 odd years, and the work is still going on, but over 6,500 of those bodies were put together and given back to their families for a decent burial. And of course, as Marcely said, it became a challenge to ensure that respect and dignity given to the victims' bodies, and in particular their families, was maintained, because it got to a point where I guess some people, I wouldn't say they became bored with the work, but it just became putting together bits of bones, and people just got so used to that they kind of lost sight of what we were doing and why we were doing it. But there was an absolute determination by the teams, and I should say that the international teams that went out to Bosnia, by 1998, over 38 countries from around the world had provided forensic experts to go out there on a rotational basis, sometimes just for a month or a few weeks, because there were busy people at home. But nevertheless, those people were absolutely determined to ensure that the victims' bodies were given back to their families as quickly as possible. But for the poor victims' families, all of the time we were so conscious of how desperate they were to know of news. For years afterwards, because of what they were told by Mladic that they might still be alive. Some women were clinging on to the fact that they might just still be alive in somewhere in Serbia.
I think this might be a nice moment, Robert, to read another section of the book, because it does relate to some of these bereaved families. And it's a scene from 1998 when you were on your second deployment in Bosnia. And it's a poignant and really honest account of how a meeting with bereaved families affected you and the forensic team.
Yeah. Is this from page 169?
I think it's 169. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It was actually my third trip to Bosnia from 96, 97, 98. Yeah, 3 years had been going on. And just to put it into some kind of context, as I've said, that the women had been waiting for such a long time, having no news of their loved ones. They put a lot of pressure. There was a lot of pressure put on them from, in particular, the Mothers of Srebrenica, a pressure group that the politicians decided would try and give them some kind of answers to their questions about the missing. So, as the days quickly passed by, work became routine, and I began to notice signs that the team had put aside their emotions and were becoming accustomed to and unaffected by the severity of the crimes we were dealing with. The term body factory came into my mind as we worked through each bag containing remnants of humanity. In the evening, we no longer talked about work. Instead, the priority became finding the best place to eat or deciphering the menu and avoiding certain delicacies. Fried brains seemed to feature often. Worryingly, more people talked about feeling homesick and about returning home. At work, I opened each bag containing body parts and bones belonging mostly to men, but there are also those of a few women, young and old, and even a few animal bones. Work was becoming routine and quite boring, until one morning Brodie, the chief pathologist, asked me to clear all the tables and lay out the contents of the bags of washed clothing removed from the victims kept in the store. There was to be an identification afternoon by the Mothers of Srebrenica. These brave women, whose men had disappeared on that sunny day in July 1995, had become impatient, having had no news of their fate of their families for 3 years, and they formed a pressure group. Because of the publicity they achieved internationally, the politicians in the West and the UN could no longer ignore them. After lunch, I noticed some Bosnian police officers shepherding about a dozen women wearing headscarves and long multi-pattern djembe dresses outside the entrance of the mortuary. 1 or 2 were already crying quietly. We all stood behind our workstations as the women hesitatingly entered the room in silence, some still shading their eyes from the bright sunshine outside. A few winced at the smell of death pervading the room. Brodie, with his clipboard, guided them round each table containing a variety of the washed and dried ragged clothing. The quiet of the room was suddenly shattered as a woman let out a scream that seemed to come from the bottom of her soul. It was so loud I felt my guts churning. The woman had recognised a victim's clothing. She became inconsolable as she was led outside by a police officer. Her reaction seemed to spark hysteria among some of the other women, who began to wail and cry in unison. 2 women, I guess one was in her 40s and the other in her late teens, were escorted to my table by a policeman. The elder of the 2 immediately pointed to a torn vest, a discoloured pair of trousers, and a single shoe. "Karim," she quietly said to the policeman. Then she turned and looked at me with tear-filled eyes, nodded silently, and said, "Mohsin, my son." To hear this woman say the name of a victim shocked me, because before this we only had referred to the victims by their impersonal grave numbers. Now a couple of ragged items of clothing had revealed to me a personality of a once-lived life. The younger woman started sobbing, her shoulders shaking uncontrollably, saying something in Bosnian I couldn't make out, but I felt there was no need to understand what she was saying. As she left the mortuary, I bit my lower lip as I resisted the urge to cry. That evening, only a few of us went out for dinner. The others said they had no appetite. The atmosphere in the restaurant was sombre, and we ate mostly in silence. The day's event had brought our focus back on as to why we were here. For that reason, I was grateful to the mothers for challenging our complacency. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No, that's so powerful, Robert. And it's really I think when we listen to that, it's just really difficult for us to wonder how you managed to deal with the emotional burden of the work you were doing. In a sense, I guess you explain in the book that you had to detach in some ways from the human tragedy to allow you to carry on doing the work and perhaps to maintain objectivity, but clearly meeting the grieving women of Srebrenica had a profound effect on you. And, their years of campaigning is, a remarkable story of bravery and resilience. I'm conscious that time is moving on very quickly. I do want to I had hoped that you were going to read another passage. I don't think we have time, but okay. I wanted to just move on briefly before we wrap up and go to the audience for questions about another experience, another difficult experience you had in Bosnia, and that related to work you were asked to do on analysis of the remains of victims who were held at the infamous Omarska camp in the Prijedor region of Bosnia way back in 1992 at the beginning of the conflict. I think there are several passages in the book where you're really trying to fathom as a person and as a father how this level of barbarity could have happened at the end of the 20th century, in a European country that doesn't look so different from our own. And you talk at different points in the book about how the imagery from the Second World War came into your mind as you pieced together evidence of war crimes. Can you talk to us a little bit about that experience of looking at the victims of the Omarska and camps in the Prijedor region?
Yes. It wasn't until the year 2000 when I travelled out there. We were still working on bodies from Srebrenica, but by this time there were victims' bodies arriving. And I should put some context in this, and the UN decided that instead of us travelling out to various areas where there were graves, it was safer and it worked much better to have a central mortuary established in the town of Visoko. And so we were accepting bodies in from all over Bosnia, and in the year 2000 we took in a large number of bodies from the Prijedor area, where I hadn't realised that concentration camps had been set up in that area, and I'm conscious that there is a woman here who was part of those terrible times, and I'm grateful to Elvira for being here. And many of the people there were in those camps were supposed to be interrogation camps, but many men, both men and women, were terribly beaten, tortured and sexually abused, and not just women, I should say, but men too, and bodies up to 150 people we were told had been killed, sometimes day after day, and put into mass graves there. The problem for the teams were that the victims' bodies had been in the graves since around 1992-93, and by this time they were really skeletons, and so it became much more of a challenge for the pathologist to try and establish the causes of death. And we were given briefings almost every day about various victims who they believed had been subjected to the worst kind of torture. And I mentioned in the passage that I was going to say that we noticed that it was some young men, their hair had turned prematurely white, and that just gave an indication of the suffering that they had gone through. And so that was that was a challenge, I must say, yet another challenge, and our hearts go out to the people who were subjected to the horrors and the hell of those camps. I must say, yet another challenge, and our hearts go out to the people who were subjected to the horrors and the hell of those camps.
Before we move to questions from the audience here at St Mungo's, I'd just like to ask you finally to maybe reflect on the legacy of the forensic work that you were involved in Bosnia. I mean, in many ways, the achievements and legacy of the International Criminal Tribunal are positive.
And when I first became involved with Remembering Srebrenica, that took me into various places, like schools and, as Marshall said, in prisons, etc., to talk about it. But one of the main reasons for actually deciding to try and get the book published was simply because of the level of genocide denial that is on the increase in Bosnia, reaching to this day a very dangerous level. And it's not just that to challenge denial. There are many ways of doing that, and I felt that if people who could try and understand that the level of evidence that was provided by the International Criminal Tribunal, by the experts that went out there, it was massive. There were, in The Hague today, there is a vault there that's got about a dozen rooms filled with evidence that we had provided there. And as I said earlier, from experts who were objective, who didn't take one side or the other. And it's worth pointing out that there were victims on all sides in this case, but the verdicts of genocide that were given out, I felt, and I can totally understand why some people from some parts of Bosnia, in particular from the Prijedor area, the crimes that were committed there weren't regarded as a genocide, and that's always concerned me. But nevertheless, there were many other crimes against humanity, and dozens of others that were found to be true. So it worries me that what's happening in Bosnia just now. Marshall is an expert on that, where the Republika Srpska is attempting to secede from Bosnia and Herzegovina and become part of what Milosevic wanted all along, was to have a greater Serbia, and that this cause is being backed financially by the Russians, who there's no need to point out what they're doing currently in Eastern Europe. But it should be said that a whole generation of children have grown up and been taught different versions of what happened in Bosnia. Serbian children, they are told that one side of the story that I believe is totally inaccurate. And so they grow up believing what their parents have told them, that it was all the fault of the Muslims. It was them that did it. They did worse to us. And that's very worrying, and that's why through the work of Remembering Srebrenica Scotland to try and highlight what happened there, because many folk in this country have never to this day heard of Srebrenica, and so through the charity Remembering Srebrenica Scotland, they're at least making an attempt, and many hundreds if not thousands of people in this country know exactly what happened there.
Thank you. I'd like to open up for questions. We probably have about, are we allowed to run over a bit? We have about, 10 minutes. So please shout out your questions, and if Robert can't hear, I will repeat them. Julie?
Sorry, can I just ask, I mentioned in my introduction about the art and the painting that you've done since that time, and we didn't get time to cover it in this interview. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and the kind of things that you've painted since then? We can all see the cover of your book here, which is one of your works.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the art that you've begun to explore since these times?
Yes. Well, when I retired, I was kind of struggling to know what to do to pass my time, given having, by that time, 40 years dealing with the dead. And my wife, Kathy, knew that I was always interested in art, and she bought me an easel as a retirement present. And so I took up painting, but strangely enough, the paintings that I started doing were paintings about my past experiences and what I had imagined had happened in Bosnia. And I didn't think that anyone would be interested in them because they're not pretty pictures. Some of them are quite disturbing, really. And but it helped me, actually, because when I retired, I started to have, I suppose you could call it, signs of PTSD that hadn't bothered me before. And I found that paintings were quite therapeutic, actually. And having meant only to do a few paintings, I ended up becoming quite obsessed by them and tried to cover as many aspects of Bosnia that I could, and including using one from my thoughts of what happened in Prijedor, and using Elvira here as an inspiration for that painting called White Armband that's been shown in the Caledonian University on White Armband Day. Anyway, through Kathy again, a gallery became interested in some of my work, and which just astonished me. But actually, it led to me really creating a new career for myself in paintings, and some of those works have ended up in different museums, one in Nuremberg in Germany, one in France, and some in the UK, including 3 in St Mungo's, and one of them is that features the cover on the book. And I would urge you, if you've got time, to pop upstairs and have a look at the paintings, not so much mine, but there is one painting there by the official war artist for the UK, Peter Howson, and he's painted quite a disturbing, huge painting, but I believe it sums up a lot of what happened in Bosnia. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you look back on the experience there as something which, even though we're in the midst of talking about the things that didn't happen and the fact that people are still denying that things happened, do you feel that you made a difference?
Wow. That's a great question and a difficult one. Did we make a difference? What I would say about that is that in 2015, I managed through Remembering Srebrenica to take a group of forensic specialists, all of whom that I had worked with out there when we returned to Bosnia. And Remembering Srebrenica had a programme where we would meet with families, victims' families. We would go and visit the beautiful cemetery at Potocari, which is just outside Srebrenica, and look at other various sites, including the mortuary in Visoko that we had worked in. And it was through talking to the relatives, particularly the mothers of Srebrenica, who were privileged to speak to, it really overwhelmed us, the fact that they were grateful for the work that we had done. And it didn't occur to us at the time that that was a word that people would use, but it was a number of years after the event. But all of the team, I think, were quite overwhelmed by the fact that to those people who, one woman said to me that she knew that we looked after her son, and that was enough for me personally for her to recognise that, because it's not something we're used to hearing, because the work that we did there, it's anonymous really. Nobody really knows, knew what it was we were doing. So it made a difference to certain people in Bosnia, particularly those who had suffered, and that gave me and others even more determination to try and talk about it in this country or anywhere else, really. The book has been published in America, and already I've given talks to students in universities there online who for the first time have learned about what happened in Bosnia. And it's worth saying that Remembering Srebrenica charities, both in the UK and in Scotland, are the only people that actually commemorate the Bosnian conflict and commemorate every year around July. And the hope is that that can be spread further abroad.
Yes, Maureen. Oh, sorry.
Elvira? No.
Was Elvira first?
Thank you, Robert. I think it's very moving to hear what you're saying. This is more, not so much a question, but just to say, I had the privilege of reading your book earlier this year, and I just want to say how deeply moving the book is and how beautifully written it is. So that, I guess this is to say to people here today, it really is not just a history and also your personal experience, but it is beautifully written and really captures in a very heartfelt way your experience there. So I just wanted to say personally thank you.
Well, thank you, Maureen, for your contribution to the back cover of the book. It was wonderful. Yeah. Elvira?
I have a question. Obviously, you know what, I then wrote that, but I just want to say back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elvira. That's a very poignant note on which to end, I think. I think Julie would like to wrap up the session, but from me to you, Robert, thank you so much. Thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you for all you do. I know it's not easy to talk about these things often.
Thanks, Marco. To all of you here today, we had a great turnout. I really appreciate you taking this time on a wet Sunday afternoon to join us. To all of you watching, thank you for your time, but most importantly to Marcelly and to Robert, thank you for doing this. Robert, we say this a lot, I think, when we hear your story, but I think on behalf of all of us, I'd like to say as well, thank you for your service in doing what you did, because you have made a difference. You made a difference to the people of Bosnia, you've made a difference to all of us who've heard your story, and to those of us who work to keep these stories alive. You have definitely made a difference. Thank you for your book, thank you for your service, and thank you for coming along today.
Thank you.
Robert's book is available over here. I think he also mentioned that if time permits, if any of you wanted to go, he would take you up and show you some of the pictures and the paintings upstairs. But I think the first thing is to invite any of you who'd like to purchase a copy to come over and get one, and Robert will sign it.
حتى يقولا إنما نحن فتنة فلا تكفر فيتعلمون منهما ما يفرقون به بين المرء وزوجه وما هم بضار